come out of here with any neck strain or anything like that. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jamie Lewis. I'm the historian at the Forest History Society here in Durham, and I want to welcome you to the 21st Annual Lynn Day Distinguished Lectureship in Forest and Conservation History. This event is sponsored by the Forest History Society, the Duke University's Department of History, and the Nicholas School of the Environment. My many thanks to everyone at the Nicholas School and the History Department for helping to make today possible. You're going to meet a couple of those folks from the Nicholas School during the course of events here this evening. Little housekeeping. First of all, your cell phones, please, please, please put them to silent or vibrate or shut it off. We really don't want to hear your magical chime during the presentation. It's very disruptive and distracting. Secondly, and on a much nicer note, mind you, there's plenty, come on in, plenty of seats. It's not too late. I'm not the presenter. I'm the presenter of the presenter who will then present our speaker. For those of you who are in the Society of American Foresters, this talk has been approved for 1 hour of CFE credit. If you want to get that credit, please make sure you sign the sheet that's sitting on the table outside the doors at the back. We'll also have it down in the lobby afterwards. So be sure to sign in and pick up your certificate sheet. Also, after the lecture, we're going to have a brief question and answer session, and then we'll adjourn to the lobby for some libations and more conversations. If you brought your copy of the Invention of Nature, you have the opportunity to have it signed today. Our lectureship is named for Lynn Weyerhaeuser Day, a longtime supporter of the Forest History Society. She was committed to forest conservation, the environment, human welfare, and international development. She believed firmly that the lessons of history can help us ask better questions, questions that will lead to better decisions now and in the future. The lectureship seeks to recognize a scholar and leader in the natural resources who is shaping our understanding of human history and environmental change. In addition to recognizing scholarship, our lectureship aims to be accessible to a broad audience on unique, provocative, and evolving topics and philosophies. To that extent, we're also live streaming today's lecture. All lecturers consider the moral challenge of living sustainably on Earth. Information about previous lectures, including video recordings of many of those, can be found on the Forest History Society's YouTube channel, which is simply youtube.com/foresthistory. Previous lecturers include historians William Cronin, Stephen Pine, Nancy Langston, Patricia Limerick, and Roderick Nash. Also policy experts David Cleaves and Duke University's own Bob Healy, and David Foster, director of the Harvard Forest. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Dan Richter of the Nicholas School.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, everybody, young and old, for showing up tonight. It's really delightful. My name is Dan Richter. I'm a professor of soils in the Nicholas School of the Environment. This year's Lynn Day Lecture is co-sponsored by the Forest History Society and a Duke Bass Connections project that is a celebration project nicknamed Humboldt Forever. Celebrating the 250th anniversary, and the initiator of this proposal is in the front seat next to Andrea Zach Breckheisen, and he and I are working together with our students. Many of them are in the front rows also, Juan. In any event, not only are we hosting Andrea's public lecture tonight, but we co-sponsor a weekly student seminar, a faculty-student reading group from across the Research Triangle. If you want to come into this group, please email me. I already got one recruit tonight, Beth. Thank you. Our class is doing 2 public exhibits, a colloquium in November with 6 of the nation's and European leading Humboldtian academics. We will also take a trip to the Smithsonian Museum to visit their 2020 Humboldt celebration, which is currently under construction. But let me formally introduce tonight's speaker in the following way. Ideas. Ideas circulate and recirculate, not always continuously. Ideas ebb and flow through time. Ideas ebb and flow through networks of people. So given that, what do the world-famous Johann Sebastian Bach, Emily Dickinson, what do these people have in common? Herman Melville, Charles Darwin, what do they all have in common other than they're very world-famous today? What they have in common is that their influence on us has wildly ebbed and flowed through time, and in the case of Melville and Dickinson, rising from near obscurity to the very first ranks of fame and influence. Thus, it's important that we appreciate the time we live in, which we're in the midst of a grand resurgence of interest in Humboldt's work, his vision, his approach, his method, and we're very pleased to host Andrea Wulf here at Duke, not only for her lecture tonight, but to honor her for her energetic telling and retelling of stories about Humboldt's way of thinking and way of doing. Stories that many cultures, but not all, but many cultures almost forgot completely. Andrea has done this mainly with her two books, her widely acclaimed 2015 book, some of you are reading it tonight, Invention of Nature, and through her 2019 graphic novel, The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, which I'm about to give my grandson in the second row. So with that, it's my honor on behalf of the Forest History Society and Duke University to welcome Andrea to Duke, to the Research Triangle.
Thank you so much. Shall I turn this away? No? Okay, you're switching off. So I've spent the good part of the last decade in the company of this man, Alexander von Humboldt, who was an adventurer, who was relentlessly curious, and who was so restless that he said about himself, he felt as if he was chased by 10,000 pigs. He is the protagonist of my book, The Invention of Nature, and the new book, The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, which is a book that was very much inspired by Humboldt's own manuscripts and drawings and engravings. But who was Alexander von Humboldt? Let me start with a few facts. Humboldt was born in 1769. That's the same year as Napoleon. He was the youngest son of a very wealthy aristocratic Prussian family in Berlin. But he left his life of privilege and he went on a 5-year exploration of Latin America. And it was a journey that shaped his life and his thinking, and that made him famous across the world. He is, in the English-speaking world, almost forgotten. He's very famous in Latin America, but in the English-speaking world, he's almost forgotten. But his name actually lingers everywhere. There are more places, plants, and animals named after Humboldt than anyone else. There is the Humboldt Current, for example, the cold ocean current that hugs the west coast of South America. There is the Humboldt penguin. Here is the Humboldt penguin drawn by Humboldt himself. The California Humboldt lily, the giant 5-foot Humboldt squid, which swims in the Humboldt Current. There are many, many, many monuments, parks, and mountains in Latin America named after him. There are mountain ranges in China, in South Africa, in New Zealand. In North America alone, there are 13 towns and 4 counties named after him. Even the state of Nevada was almost called Humboldt when the name was discussed in the 1860s. And I would have loved to say Las Vegas Humboldt, but that didn't quite happen. There is a Humboldt Glacier in Greenland, the widest glacier in the northern hemisphere. And let's see how long that one will survive global warming, because just as so many other glaciers in Greenland, this one is also melting. And it's kind of ironic because Humboldt already warned in the year 1800 of harmful human-induced climate change. He could not know how devastating it would be. He did not know the effect of CO2 on the climate. He could not imagine how greedy we will be. But in the year 1832, he listed the 3 ways in which humans affected the climate, and this is what he wrote. He said, they do this through the destruction of forests, through the distribution of water, i.e. irrigation, and through the production of great masses of steam and gas at the industrial centers. 1832, so pretty prophetic, but more about that a little bit later. So I thought I'm going to let him introduce himself. We did a little 2.5-minute animation for the new book, for the graphic novel, and I just thought I'm going to show you that.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Alexander von Humboldt. I 1,400 miles we paddled along the Orinoco River, deep in the rainforest. I loved every minute, no matter how dangerous it was. We nearly drowned when our boat capsized. Luckily, we only lost one book. We also met indigenous people. I learned a lot from them. They really are the best observers of nature I've ever encountered. Of course, we encountered many dangerous animals. We crossed the Andes and climbed every reachable volcano. We went higher than anyone before us. On our way towards Lima, we found many Inca ruins. Later in Mexico, I copied many Aztec hieroglyphs. I brought them back to Europe. But I also saw how humans destroyed nature everywhere. When I returned from South America, I wrote about the devastating effects caused by deforestation, monoculture, and irrigation. I even warned about harmful human-induced climate change, but nobody listened. But excuse me, I better stop talking so that you can read about my adventures.
So he's not lying. He was the most famous scientist of his age. He was so famous that his contemporaries said he was the most famous man after Napoleon. They called him the Shakespeare of the sciences. He influenced scientists, artists, politicians, poets, revolutionaries. Thomas Jefferson, for example, called him one of the greatest ornaments of the age. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that he was one of the wonders of the world. Napoleon was jealous of him. Charles Darwin said he would have never boarded the Beagle without Alexander von Humboldt. Henry David Thoreau's would have been a very different book without Humboldt. Simón Bolívar, the man who liberated the Spanish colonies in South America, called him the discoverer of the New World. John Muir's ideas on forest preservation were heavily influenced by Humboldt's ideas, and Germany's greatest poet, Goethe, said spending a few days with Alexander von Humboldt was like having lived several years. He died in 1859, just before his 90th birthday, and then 10 years later, in September 1869, Humboldt's 100th birthday was celebrated across the world. And when I say across the world, I really do mean across the world. There were parties everywhere. There were parties in Moscow, in Melbourne, in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, in Egypt. 80,000 people marched through the streets of Berlin. But some of the greatest celebrations were actually here in the United States. There were parties from Chicago to Charleston, from Philadelphia to Boston. The President, Ulysses Grant, celebrated with 10,000 Humboldt fans in Pittsburgh, for example. 25,000 people marched through the streets of Manhattan from the southern tip to Central Park, where they unveiled a Humboldt bust, which is still standing there today. So America was utterly in love with Humboldt, yet he's almost completely forgotten here. So why should we care about a man who's been dead and almost forgotten here? Well, I think we should care quite a lot, because I think there are quite a few reasons why Humboldt is still important today. One is that Humboldt came up with a concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today. He came up with this idea that nature is a web of life. He described Earth as a living organism where everything was connected, from the smallest insect to the tallest trees. He also united the arts and the sciences at a time when other scientists were looking through the very narrow lens of classification. He talked about global vegetation and climate zones. He invented isotherms, the wavy lines which we can still see today on our weather maps. He was a pioneering cartographer. He visualized scientific data. He's really, I think, the founder of what we call today infographics. Here's an example of a map of plant distribution. And here in the detail, you can see how he's using color coding and symbols to show global vegetation zones. He is also the forgotten father of environmentalism. He warned about the devastating effects of deforestation, irrigation, and monoculture, and maybe most amazingly, he predicted harmful human-induced climate change already in 1800. So he was a pretty extraordinary human being. In Germany, he is undergoing a little bit of a renaissance at the moment, probably helped by the fact that it's his 250th birthday in 2019. But even politicians are rediscovering Alexander von Humboldt. Germany's federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. So the German federal president is the representative head of state, a bit like the Queen in England. So he went in February of this year to Ecuador and Colombia to follow Humboldt's footsteps and to inaugurate his 250th birthday. And I had the honor to being part of the German delegation here. I'm boarding the German equivalent of Air Force One. And in Quito, President Steinmeier gave a long speech about Alexander von Humboldt, 50 minutes, in which he called him the father of ecology, and in which he also warned, we only have this one planet, and therefore we can't continue like this. Now, if someone had told me 8 years ago, when I was sitting on my own in an archive researching the invention of nature, that in the year 2019 I would listen to Germany's federal president give a speech about Humboldt's importance and relevance for today's climate change debates, I would have never believed that. And then in the same week, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel quoted Humboldt at the Munich Security Conference. So that was a pretty good week for a Humboldt biographer. And then this September, the German Post Office printed a new stamp, which is based on the German cover of my book. 5 million of them. So this is the most common stamp to put on a German letter. Sadly, I don't get any royalties for that. So the Invention of Nature was my attempt to find Humboldt and to try and help a little bit to kind of that he should kind of go back in this temple of nature and science where he belongs, just as Isaac Newton or Charles Darwin. And the good thing about writing a book about an explorer is that you obviously have to travel the world, all in the name of research. And I thought I'd show you a few steps of this journey. So I read his notes in the archives in Berlin, and I don't know if you can see that. No, it's a pretty good big screen here. So he has the worst handwriting on the planet. That's the one thing that was really quite painful about doing this book. I found Humboldt's passport in an archive in Quito. So this is the passport the Spanish king had given Humboldt, and that allowed him to travel through the Spanish colonies. I read Darwin's copies of Humboldt's books. So they are in an archive in Cambridge, and these two books actually went with Darwin on the Beagle across the world. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. I went to the mines in Germany where Humboldt was trained as a mining inspector, on Antisana, a volcano in Ecuador at, God, I've just done so many talks in Germany, so I'm doing meters now, not feet. 4,000 meters, 13,000 feet. I found this hut, which is the hut in which Humboldt had spent a night. And at that very moment, this herd of wild horses suddenly turned up, and I was standing in the middle of them, and 4 condors were circling above my head. So that was a pretty good day of research. 6 years later, Germany's President Steinmeier at the same hut, not quite as alone as I had been in 2013. I flew with a helicopter over some of the volcanoes that he had climbed, but I climbed also a lot of them myself. I went to the mountains in Colombia, I went to Mexico City. And one of the most exciting moments for me was Chimborazo, another volcano in Ecuador, and a mountain that was elemental to Humboldt's vision of nature, and more about that a little bit later too. In 2013, I went to Venezuela to paddle along the Orinoco, and then last year I went to the remote Muir rapids, also in Colombia, at the border between Colombia and Venezuela, where we filmed the Humboldt documentary. And I'm going to show you a very short 1-minute clip from the Orinoco, just so that you get a sense of the landscapes that Humboldt had experienced. So let me tell you a little bit about the expedition. Humboldt and the French botanist Aimé Bonpland, who you can see here on the right, left Europe in June 1799. And I'm going to have to skip over some really exciting bits here, so you're going to have to read the book for that. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor what kind of man Alexander von Humboldt was. He was not a cerebral scholar. He was daringly adventurous, and he again and again put his body into his sciences. So he, for example, drank the deadly curare poison which the indigenous people used in their blowguns. He rubbed chemicals into self-inflicted wounds. He was the most experienced mountaineer of his age. He experimented again and again, and one of the most crazy experiments he did was were experiments with electric eels. Electric eels are these strange 5-foot fish that can deliver electric shocks up to 600 volts. And when he was in Venezuela, he heard from the locals that the electric eels were living in the mud of the bottom of the shallow ponds. And he wanted to dissect them, but you can't just catch them because that would mean instant death. So what they did is I'm going to show in between some of the pages from the graphic novel. So this is one of the pages from the new book. So what they did is they drove a herd of 30 horses into the pond, and the hooves of the horses kind of churned up the mud. That brought the electric eels up. They then discharged themselves against the belly, kind of thrashed against the belly of the horses and discharged their electric shocks. And then they could experiment with them. From there, they went to the Orinoco and the surrounding networks of rivers. 2,500 miles they paddled along the rivers, 75 grueling days deep in the rainforest. And they encountered dangerous animals, they suffered from high fevers, they almost starved to death, and they also had their boat capsized on the Orinoco. And this is one of my favorite pages from the new book, because you can see them here capsizing, but the river, the Orinoco itself, is made out of his diary pages from that time at the Orinoco. But my favorite part is here that Humboldt is rescuing his diary through the watermark that actually originated from that accident. So you can see the page here with the watermark. So it was dangerous there, but they also encountered the biggest web of life on our planet, the rainforest. And Humboldt was interested in everything. He was fascinated by the animals. They collected plants. These are two of the plant specimens that are today in the Botanical Garden in Berlin, collected by Bonpland and Humboldt. But he was not just interested in nature, he was also fascinated by the indigenous people. And he again and again said that they were the best observers of nature, the best geographers he'd ever met. He often included them in his engravings. So here is one, it's a detail. Humboldt is, of course, the one with the top hat, because what else would you wear when you go climbing the Andes? In his diary, he collected their languages. So this is a page where he wrote down all the languages of the indigenous people that he had encountered along the Orinoco. He talked to them. He was fascinated by their worship of nature, and wrote in his diary again and again what they told him. So, for example, this is a quote from one of his diary where they said to him, "Your God keeps himself shut up in a house as if he were old and infirm. Ours is in the forest, in the fields, and on the mountains where the rain comes from." So he notes everything. He speaks to them and he notes it down. As he traveled through South America, he also saw how humankind was destroying nature. And he notes this in particular at Lake Valencia, which is in northern Venezuela, which was then a very wealthy agricultural region. And he saw how plantation owners had completely destroyed the forest here, how heavy rains had washed off the good topsoil. And seeing this destruction, Humboldt was the first to explain the fundamental function of the forest for the ecosystem without using the word ecosystem. The term didn't exist then, but he talked about the tree's ability to store water, their ability to enrich the atmosphere with moisture, and their protection against soil erosion. And it was here at Lake Valencia that he first talked about harmful human-induced climate change. He saw this destruction all over Latin America. So, for example, he saw how ruthless pearl fishing had completely depleted the oyster stocks. In Mexico City, he saw how the local irrigation system had left the surrounding valleys completely barren. And he writes in his diary, I think they are raping nature. So he's using the word raping. He's very, very clear about his criticism. There are moments when he's very pessimistic about the future. There's one diary entry that I found from 1801 where he said, there might be a future in which humans will travel to distant planets. And he said, and if we do that, we will take our lethal mixture of arrogance, greed, and violence with us, and we will leave these distant planets as barren and as ravaged as we've already done with Earth. From Venezuela, he went to Havana, and then back to South America, Cartagena, Bogota, Quito, all the way south to Lima. As they crossed the Andes, he climbed every reachable volcano. And when you read his letters and his diaries, you have sometimes the feeling that the more difficult it was, the more Humboldt seemed to have enjoyed himself. I found a letter that he wrote to a friend in Germany from Latin America. It's a long letter in which he describes all the dangers that he had encountered, the jaguar, which almost killed him, the accident on the Orinoco. And the last sentence of this letter is this: and you, dearest, how's your monotonous life? So he's also a bit of a show-off. He's quite a flawed personality, which I think makes him much more interesting. So the crown of his volcano obsession was Chimborazo, a mountain that was almost 21,000 feet high and was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world. It's about 100 miles, 150 miles south of Quito. And I'm going to show you again another 50-second film clip from the documentary with Chimborazo. So Humboldt and his small team climbed Chimborazo on the 23rd of June, 1802. And it was a foggy day, and they were crawling on hands and knees along a very narrow ridge, and the icy wind had numbed their hands and feet. Their eyes were bloodshot. Their gums were bleeding. They could hardly see anything because it was so foggy. They're at around 17,000 feet, and they're really struggling to breathe in the thin air. But Humboldt stops every few hundred yards, and he takes out his instruments, and he measures everything. So they kind of crawl on, and then suddenly the fog lifts, and they can see the snow-capped peak of Chimborazo in the blue sky, but they can also see a huge crevasse right in front of them. And they are at 19,413 feet, which is about 1,000 feet below the peak. And Humboldt very quickly realizes that there's no way to cross this crevasse. So they can't go any higher. And although they can't go any higher, they've achieved something really remarkable. No one had ever been so high anywhere. And as he's standing on what he thinks is the highest point on this planet, his vision of nature clarifies, and everything seems to fall into place. And he says, it all makes sense now. And Bonpland says, what? Traveling from Quito traveling from Quito and up Chimborazo is like a botanical journey from the equator towards the poles. We are nowhere near the pole. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the plants. First, we saw tropical plants such as daturas and palms in the valleys. And then, as we climbed higher, there were conifers and oaks similar to those in Europe. The alpine plants further up reminded me of those in Switzerland. And lichen? Well, you can also find them in Lapland. It's incredible. Families of plants from across the world, just all stacked up on top of each other. No one had ever looked at plants like this. So where other scientists were looking through the very narrow lens of classification, or were kind of imposing this quite hierarchical system of classification upon nature, Humboldt saw nature as a global force where everything was connected. And his brother, Wilhelm, said that he believed that Alexander's mind was made to connect ideas and to detect chains of things. And I think that is a very important aspect of his thinking. And he shows us these connections in his famous so-called Naturgemälde, which was a big fold-out in one of his books, 3 by 2 foot wide. And what you see here is Chimborazo, and on Chimborazo, you see these kind of black lines. These are the names of the plants he had found as he climbed the Andes. And he draws them into the mountain at the height where he had found them. And then to the left and to the right, you have 20 columns in which he gives all kinds of scientific measurements of gravity, humidity, the chemical components of the air. Again, all drawn into the columns at the height where he had measured it. So what you can do is you can trace one line across the entire mountain, and you get all the information there is, say, about at the height of 15,000 feet. So it's packed with complex scientific data, yet it is so easy to understand. And I think it's one of the first pieces of infographics, basically. So in the new book, in the Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt, we had to, of course, also have the Naturgemälde as a big fold-out. But we added the people, or some of the famous people that were influenced by Humboldt. So Goethe, for example, the German poet, Charles Darwin, Simón Bolívar, John Muir, but also the climate scientists who had followed Humboldt's footsteps up Chimborazo in 2012, and who had discovered by using his historic data that the plants had moved in the past 200 years, had moved 1,500 feet up in tandem with rising temperatures and with the retreat of the glacier. So Humboldt is obsessed with measurements. He carries 42 scientific instruments across Latin America. But, and I think that's very important, he's not just interested in empirical data. He says again and again that we need to, in order to understand nature, we need to also use our imagination and our feelings. He said, nature must be experienced through feeling and imagination. And he's really driven, I think, by a sense of wonder for nature. So he's not just a scientist, or he does not just describe nature like a scientist, but also like a poet. So in his books, he combines, for example, evocative landscape descriptions with scientific observations. And for him, nature is not just a mechanical system, it's this world full of wonders that wait to be discovered by him. And my favorite quote, my favorite Humboldt quote is this, where he says, "What speaks to the soul escapes our measurements." So for him, nature is this living organism. But he's also fascinated by the ancient civilizations. And as he travels through Peru, for example, he draws and sketches again and again Inca ruins. He spends a year in Mexico. Here you can see him with his 21 mules packed with his collections from walking from Acapulco to Mexico City. In Mexico, he spends a lot of time in the archives. He copies, for example, hieroglyphs and takes them back to Europe. And he brings back to Europe a portrait of these ancient civilizations that show the Europeans that these are sophisticated cultures with rich languages and rich architecture. In April 1804, Humboldt decides that it's time to return to Europe, but he adds a little bit of a detour because he wants to visit this man, Thomas Jefferson, who was then the third president of the United States. And the timing of Humboldt's visit was absolutely perfect because Jefferson had just acquired in the previous year the Louisiana Territory. And with that, Mexico was the new neighbor of the United States, and Humboldt had just been in Mexico for a year. So Jefferson bombarded Humboldt with questions, and Humboldt very happily unpacked his notebooks and his maps to brief the President of the United States and left him with a report on New Spain, which you can still read today in the Library of Congress. Humboldt returned to Europe in August 1804, and he brought with him 60,000 plant specimens, 6,000 species, of which 2,000 or almost 3,000 were new to European botanists. And I'm not going to show you 60,000, don't worry, but there's just a few of them. But he also returned with hundreds of sketches and drawings and maps. And I just wanted to show you a few of them because I think it shows a very important part of his interest, and it shows also that his interests are incredibly broad. So he comes back again and again in his manuscripts. You can see these profiles of mountains. This is his sketch of a monkey, and then you can see the same monkey in one of his zoological publications as a hand-colored engraving. Here, his drawing of an orchid, and then the same orchid as in his botanical publications. He worked together with 50 artists and cartographers for his publications. Again and again, you have tables of all his measurements in his diaries. A map of the Rio Magdalena, one of the rivers he paddled along. More profiles of volcanoes. This is one of my favorite sketches, this tiny little sketch, and you see 5 mountains from across the world, and he puts them next to each other and compares the height of the snow line according to the latitude. So everything is about comparison in Humboldt's mind. The valley of the Orinoco, a bone of a llama, the fish from the Orinoco, a little bird in the rainforest, the Humboldt penguin. And this is, I love this page. This is a page from the time in the Andes where he sketches the tent in which they sleep. And he explains that they built this tent every night made them out of branches, and then they cover them with these leaves. And he explains that this is a very watertight construction. Inca ruins, a map of South America, and this is very special. This is the first sketch of what then becomes the Naturgemälde. So you can see that he's really interested in everything. Once in Europe, he decides to settle in Paris, because the reason for that is that there's no other city in Europe so deeply steeped in the sciences. And he very quickly becomes the center of scientific inquiry. He lectures, he experiments, he publishes books. He jumps so quickly from one subject to another that very few people can actually follow him. And I wanted to show you a couple more of his manuscripts because I think we can learn a lot about a person when we look at their manuscripts and their handwriting. So these are his lecture notes. And he kind of starts fairly conventional. So, he writes down his his ideas, and then he runs out of space and he kind of squeezes stuff in the corner, but then he runs completely out of space. And you would think he then takes a new sheet of paper, but no. He then begins to write his ideas on little bits of paper, which he all sticks on top of each other. He reads something in a book and he tears it out. And I think what we can see is that he does not just see nature as a web of life. It's also how his mind works. Humboldt does not think in a linear way. In Paris, he was a very busy man. During the day, he had his scientific work, and then in the evenings, he rushed from one party to another party, often 4 or 5 in the evening. He had the reputation of talking without ever stopping. Some of his friends said that he was like an overcharged instrument that never stopped playing. There were quite a few guests who refused to leave a party before Humboldt had departed because he had the reputation of being a bit of a gossip. So, they were really worried that they would be the object of his snide comments once they had left. He could only sustain this rather frantic work pace by sleeping very little, 3 or 4 hours a night, and by drinking lots and lots of coffee, which he called concentrated sunshine, which I think is such a good image for coffee. For 30 years, he had this parrot called Jacob on his shoulder. Jacob was actually female. Today, Jacob is at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And Jacob could only say one sentence, and that was, more coffee, more sugar. So we do know that he liked his concentrated sunshine very, very sweet. In 1827, he moved very reluctantly from Paris to Berlin. He had run completely out of money, and the Prussian king, who had paid him a salary for the past 20 years, kind of insisted that the most famous Prussian had to move back to Berlin. So he reluctantly moved back, but he still managed to have some fun. 2 years later, in 1829, he went on yet another expedition, this time to Russia, all expenses paid for by the Russian Tsar. They traveled 10,000 miles in 6 months and used 12,244 horses because they changed the horses every 20 to 30 miles. So Humboldt was age 60 now, and he was as restless as he had been as a young man. When he returned to Berlin, he was finally ready to write the book that would make him famous in the world, Cosmos. The first volume was published in 1845. It was a huge international bestseller, and in Cosmos, he took his readers on an extraordinary voyage, a voyage from Earth to the stars, to the distant stars, from the tiniest fleck of moss to the highest volcanoes. He wrote about botany, but also about poetry and landscape painting. He wrote about the migration of the human race. He wrote about the northern lights, about geomagnetism. And he wrote a book that was unlike any other book published at that time. So at a time when other scientists were crawling into their ever-narrowing disciplines, Humboldt wrote a book that did exactly the opposite. He wrote a book that brought everything together. And he described nature as this pulsating web of life in Cosmos. He described nature here as a wonderful web of organic life. Now, in the Invention of Nature, I write about Humboldt, but I also write about the people that he influenced, and we don't have time for that tonight. I just wanted to briefly explain to you a little bit how he influenced one very famous man, Charles Darwin. Darwin read Humboldt's book, Personal Narrative, which you can see here on the right, as a young man. And it was a book that changed everything for Darwin. So let's hear it from Darwin himself. This is what Darwin said. My admiration of his famous personal narrative, part of which I almost know by heart, determined me to travel to distant countries and led me to volunteer as naturalist on Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. On the Beagle, Darwin kept Humboldt's books on a shelf next to his hammock. And when we read these books today, and they're amazingly still in an archive, you can see that Darwin underlined everything. I mean, and he writes in the margins. And reading this is almost like listening to Darwin having a conversation with Humboldt. Because Humboldt influenced Darwin in many, many different ways. One thing he did is he was actually, Humboldt's writing about South America was the inspiration for Darwin to actually wanting to go to South America. Once Darwin was in South America, he understood this new world through Humboldt's writings, at least in the beginning. And this is what Darwin said when he first arrived in Brazil. I am at present fit only to read Humboldt. He, like another sun, illuminates everything I behold. So Darwin used Humboldt's books also as a model for his own writing. So when you read Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, you'll see it's very similar in style to Humboldt's personal narrative. Like Humboldt, Darwin also brings together poetic landscape descriptions with scientific observations. While Darwin was working on his evolutionary theory, he used Humboldt's books again and again to find examples. In fact, one of Humboldt's books was the last book that Darwin read before he died. A friend called Humboldt later a pre-Darwinian Darwinist. In Humboldt's books, Darwin read sentences and underlined sentences such as the gradual transformation of species. And so that you see that I'm not making this up. I just want to show you one page. So this is Darwin's handwriting in one of his Humboldt books in volume 5 of Personal Narrative. And I'm going to read you what Darwin wrote here. So he wrote, to show how animals prey on each other, what a positive check. So here you have it, in a nutshell, the concept of natural selection written in pencil by Darwin into one of his copies of Humboldt's books. So, but the story, the relationship between Darwin and Humboldt has an almost tragic end, because they finally meet in 1842, so this is after the Voyage of the Beagle, and Humboldt comes to London, and Charles Darwin is so excited to finally meet his hero, who's almost grown to mythical proportions in his head. And Humboldt is in his 70s, Darwin is in his early 30s. Humboldt is really the most famous scientist of his age. Humboldt kind of comes into the room and he just shovels in and he just begins to talk. And he talks for 3 hours and Darwin cannot get a single word in. He's so frustrated that he wrote to a friend that Humboldt was chattering beyond all reason. So Humboldt influences a lot of people like Goethe, people like Henry David Thoreau, people like Frederick Edwin Church. And I would like to end with a thought about Humboldt and his kind of bringing together the arts and the sciences. Because he does not just influence scientists, he also influences artists and poets. And for me, Humboldt is this bridge between the Enlightenment and the Romantics, between the rational and the emotional. And on the one side, we have scientists such as Isaac Newton, who explained that rainbows were created by light refracting through raindrops. And on the other side, we have romantic poets such as John Keats, who wrote that Newton has destroyed all the poetry of the rainbow by reducing it to a prism. And for me, Humboldt is this bridge. And I think we tend to draw a very sharp line between the arts and the sciences. between the objective and the subjective. But I think that Humboldt's insight that we need to use our imagination and our feelings to understand nature is maybe more relevant and more important than ever before. When I hear the environmental debates, at least in the political arena, what I'm really missing is passion, is emotion, is no one dares to talk about the awe for nature, the wonder of nature, the recognition that we are only going to protect what we love. So politicians and scientists tend to throw statistics at us, numbers, figures, but I'm missing the passionate, dare I say, emotional advocacy for our planet. And I think that we don't just need engineers and scientists to sort out this mess. I think we also might need some artists and some poets and some writers and some musicians who dare to bring another, maybe more emotional dimension into this debate. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. So there's a photographer in Belfast, Robin Price, and through experimental photography, he's found a way to visualize the dangerous, fine particulate matter in air. So he shows them like this. So you can see that these little fairy lights. So instead of figures such as 30 micrograms per cubic meter, we see this. This is Mexico City. This is at the Welsh coast. And this, very shockingly clear, is Delhi. And for me, that shows air pollution much better than just figures. Or, for example, the artist Olafur Eliasson, he brought huge blocks of glacier ice to Copenhagen, to Paris, and to London, and created with these melting ice blocks a kind of tangible experience of global warming and the melting Arctic ice. So I think we can't just only rely on science. I think we need to bring the science and the arts together. And for me, a perfect example of that is this photograph of Earthrise, which was taken during the Apollo 8 mission and which has been hailed as the beginning of the environmental movement, because this was the first time that we saw our Earth in her wholeness, this tiny white and blue marble set against the vastness and blackness of space. Utterly beautiful, unimaginably fragile. And I think that was a recognition that was carried by a sense of wonder. And it's a photograph taken in a scientific context. And I don't think that we can rescue our planet if we only talk about the percentage of, air pollution. But we don't dare to talk about the unique smell of a forest after a sudden rain shower on a hot summer day, or if we only talk about the rising acidity of the oceans, but we don't dare to talk about the beauty of wild waves. And I don't just mean wild nature. I also mean little moments in cities. When I listen to the dawn choir of the dawn chorus of the birds in my bedroom in central London, or when I see a little flower growing in the crack on the pavement on my way to the tube station. And I think we all know how bad oil production is for our planet, but it's not rational arguments, it's not figures, it's the photograph of a black oil-drenched bird that makes us think about this. We all know how terrible plastic is, but it is the photograph of a beached whale with his stomach full of plastic that makes us kind of stop. And for me, it feels as this has all come kind of full circle, because Humboldt said 150 years ago that nature was in a mysterious communication with our inner feelings. So maybe now, in 2019, the year where we celebrate Humboldt's 250th birthday, is the moment that we can take a little bit of inspiration from him. Thank you.
couple of questions.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was really struck by the manner in which you chose to close your presentation, which was wonderful. And so, in particular, the idea of nature as being something not just that is out there away from where we are, but is something that we're engaged with every day. And I'm curious how you see von Humboldt's role in the concept of nature as something that was out there and remote and that one went to visit versus something in which we're embedded, and how he fits into that, those frames of thought.
So let me just repeat the question. So the question is, so there's this, on the one hand, there's this idea nature is something out there, away from us, and the other is we are part of nature. And where does Humboldt fit in there? I think Humboldt fits right in there, actually explaining that we are part of this web of life. There's a beautiful passage in a letter where he talks about how one life is poured over stones, insects, plants, and humans. So he very much explains that we are all part of this and that we're all together on this one planet. And because he sees these connections, I think that's why he's one of the first to understand how we can, how we have also the power to destroy these connections. And this is why he understands the effects of deforestation, for example. Yes?
Was Russia financing all these expeditions?
Say that again. Who financed them?
Yeah.
So the question is the finance of the expedition. Well, he was a very wealthy son, or he inherited a huge fortune when his mother died when he was in his mid-20s. He was so delighted that he didn't even go to her funeral. Because he could finally go on his big voyage, because she had not wanted him to do this. So he was very, very rich, and what he does is he spends half of his money basically on his expeditions. That gives him a completely different role in the world of explorers, because other explorers traveled in the name of a monarch or a government. Humboldt traveled as a private person, so he was much more nimble to decide where he would go. Then he comes back, and then he spends the other half of his fortune on working together with the 50 artists and cartographers to creating these very opulent books. And he dies a very poor man. So he actually owes his servant so much money that his servant gets his entire library.
One last question.
Yes? Yeah.
I was wondering about, for him to have traveled to South America kind of when it was getting colonized, what were his thoughts on colonization and the role that played in maybe contributing to science, but also like deforestation and others related?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So the question is, so Humboldt is traveling through the Spanish colonies. What are his thoughts of colonization and also in terms of the destruction of the environment? So he was a great critic of the Spanish rule, which is a little bit ironic because the Spanish king gave him permission to travel through his colonies, and Humboldt pays it back by writing books criticizing the Spanish king. Which is one of the reasons why the British didn't let him go to India, because they were like, no, we're not going to let you in here. So what he does is, so he sees what happens, how the Spaniards treat the indigenous people. He's one of the very first things he sees is a slave market. He is a lifelong abolitionist. He sees how the missionaries treat the indigenous people. And then he also sees, and I think he's really the first to connect colonialism with the destruction of the environment. So, for example, he sees, when he's in Cuba, he sees how sugar plantations has pretty much destroyed the nature, but also how this is a completely unsustainable way in terms of economics, because the island can't even feed itself. So they have to import other food products to eat. So he makes these connections. He sees how mining destroys not just the land, but also mistreats and exploits the indigenous people. So he makes these connections. He's very open about this criticism.
Okay, we'd like to thank you for attending.